Hello, excuse us coming through.
Physics professor Ronald Drever of Caltech, 85, now retired, is the third man in the troika that built LIGO. He suffers from dementia and stays in a care home in Edinburgh.
One of the interferometers.
Was it a success?
Oh yes, of course.
Ron is credited for turning LIGO into one of the most sensitive instruments ever to be built for detecting gravitational waves. The longer LIGO's arms, the farther the laser beam travels, the more sensitive LIGO gets in detecting changes in the length of the arms. But LIGO's arms are only 4 kilometers long. Ron came up with an idea to install extra mirrors in the arms to reflect the laser beam back and forth 280 times before it merges with the beam from the other arm. This increases the distance the laser travels from 4 kilometers to 1,120 kilometers. LIGO is so sensitive, it can detect any changes in the arm's length 10,000 times smaller than a proton.
It was Ron Drever who first realized that this could be accomplished. It was a new idea. We didn't really know whether the techniques could be developed, but we made enough progress that we convinced ourselves that this was the way to go for LIGO.
Ron grew up in Glasgow, Scotland. He loved tinkering with and making things because of his Uncle Reg.
The propeller was made by Reg.
What else is in the wee box, Ron?
Ian is Ron's brother.
Part of these small electric motors.
Who made the electric motor?
I did.
This is the lab where Ron did experiments while pursuing his science degree and PhD in the 1950s at Glasgow University.
When you had an idea, you would work away non-stop, all night time.
Yes, maybe that's right.
For your eating, it was a bit of a nuisance to you. You couldn't be bothered much.
Yes.
Ian studied medicine in Glasgow University.
I would come along later on to see it was all right, and I would go up the steps. Just try and see him, or I would knock on the windows over there, because I knew that was where he would be.
From the 1960s, Ron taught at Glasgow University and worked as an experimental physicist. Anne is Ron's niece.
You've always enjoyed making things, Ronald.
Oh yes.
And also taking things apart to see how they worked.
Yes.
He very much believed that Glasgow University was his academic home. It's where he first had the freedom to fully experiment, but also having the tools to do so, which he didn't have, obviously, when he was at school.
This is the first prototype of an interferometer Ron started building in 1971.
It's interesting to see how the wiring actually stood up so well with time.
Physics professors James Huff and Henry Ward both worked for Ron at his lab in Glasgow.
The suspension is still taking the weight. It was exciting because Ron was full of energy and full of good ideas. He was very, very good in the lab, modifying pieces of apparatus or really finding ways to do things that other people would not have found.
All the experimental challenges. And I think that's what Ron enjoyed. It's what he engendered in the people that worked with him. He always taught us you were up against yourself, your abilities, you were up against your apparatus, you were up against nature, and you had to fight all of them. You never ever accepted anything at face value. You always pushed and asked questions, and so that he was always asking questions. And I think that's what you need to be a good experimentalist.
In 1979, Caltech hired Ron to work on building a 40-meter prototype of laser gravitational wave detector. This is the prototype today that Ron started, now being used to test technique for LIGO to use in detecting gravitational waves. Physics professor Rana Adhikari used to work for Ron as a postdoc.
Ron is one of those, he's a super creative guy, discussing any kind of technical problem. he'll have a different solution for each of those problems every day.
Ron was an unusual person. First, he was totally devoted to science. That was his whole life. And he was friendly, unworldly. Pretty much his mind was always jumping from one thing to another. He would take things apart to see how they work. He would investigate all sorts of little clever properties of materials, new rare earth magnets, whether they could be used to make supports for the test masses in something like LIGO.
Ron was more of the stereotypical scientist who can't remember where his shoes or his keys were and had no idea whether he was supposed to be in a meeting or not, but was always thinking about his experiment. He was sort of the creative guy thinking off in left field.
Physics professor Rainer Weiss, 83, is credited for inventing LIGO's laser interferometer gravitational wave detector. This is his prototype from the early 1970s.
I built this myself in a shop. I love to make things.
At MIT, Ray earned his science degree in 1955, PhD in 1962, and became professor of physics in 1964, as well as an experimental physicist.
Well, the LIGO story begins in a course I was teaching.
Massive stars or black holes that collide with each other generate gravitational waves.
The wave travels at the velocity of light away from that source. It stretches space in the east-west direction at the same time as compressing space in the north-south direction. Our detector exploits that as a way of making the detection of the wave.
There are actually two LIGOs, in Hanford, Washington State, and in Livingston, Louisiana. Each has two L-shaped arms 4 kilometers long. A laser is beamed inside a tube and split into two. The light goes back and forth between two mirrors at each end of the arms. The beams cancel out each other when they arrive at the same time. But a passing gravitational wave changes the light's timing and the distance between mirrors suspended in space. One arm lengthens, the other shortens, warping space and time by the minutest of motions, 1,000 times smaller than the width of a proton.
The fundamental idea is timing light, and you will measure the gravitational waves. Gravitational radiation, it goes through stars, it goes through galaxies, it goes through the Earth, it goes through us. So with this, we can look deeper into the universe than we ever did before.
In 2001, he became Professor Emeritus at MIT, but Ray, 83, is still active in LIGO.
Ray is a person who can't stand not to touch things. He's a very hands-on, very, very enthusiastic person. And sometimes undiplomatic. He speaks his mind.
He's very generous with his time and incredibly hardworking.
He works 18, 20 hours a day.
Ray's wife, Rebecca, a retired librarian. They have 2 kids.
He was always searching for answers. He gave that to our children too. He's continually having them analyze and understand what they were seeing and doing.
I had the great good fortune to build a collaboration with Ray Weiss and Ron Drever.
Kip Thorne is credited for providing the theoretical models of gravitational waves that enabled LIGO to know what to look for in the signals it picks up.
When I was 8 years old, my mother took me to a lecture about the solar system, and I fell in love with astronomy.
He got his science degree in 1962 from California Institute of Technology and his PhD in 1965 from Princeton University. He formed a research group on gravitational waves while he was a postdoc in 1966 and became an associate professor at Caltech a year later. From the mid-1970s to the 1990s, he collaborated with Rainer Weiss and Donald Drever to research and develop LIGO funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation.
In the mid-1980s, gravitational waves were considered a bit of a loony field. Not everybody believed in the existence of black holes.
Everybody thought that this was a complete waste of $1 billion and it would be much better spent on building lots of optical telescopes and radio telescopes, X-ray telescopes.
There were scientists who were skeptical of whether the great waves would be strong enough to ever be detected, whether the technology could really be developed successfully. That was stressful. Many sleepless nights, a lot of worry, and a lot of effort to explain to the world what the big payoff was likely to be.
Kip led efforts to model the likely shape and source of gravitational waves, plus other patterns to be matched with signals LIGO picks up.
The simulations were absolutely crucial for being able to extract the information that comes with the waves. I thought it was likely that the first thing we would see was massive black holes merging. So I had a sense of profound satisfaction that I had made all the right choices.
The biggest thing that he did was actually convince the people around the world that LIGO had a great scientific potential and that basically just keep cheerleading it. Without that part, it would never have gotten funded even.
Gold Beach, Oregon.
Small town.
Small town. A beautiful location. The ocean and the forest.
Kip, 76, now retired from physics, has settled down here with his wife, Carol Lee.
We looked for some place to have a working home. I can sit and think about physics or writing. It's an ideal place to stimulate my creativity. My second career, which I started about a decade ago, involves collaborations with musicians and artists and filmmakers.
We're still pioneers. We've barely begun.
Kip was an executive producer for the 2014 Hollywood movie Interstellar, based on the science he provided.
It's a movie describing, for a general audience, the strange phenomena that occur when space and time are warped.
The warping of space inside here.
I'm here talking with Christopher Nolan, explaining to him about what happens inside a black hole.
His equations helped the studio visualize black holes and wormholes on the film. The movie later won an Oscar for Best Visual Effects. The professor in the movie, played by actor Michael Caine, was based on Kip.
I'd been a conventional professor for nearly 50 years. I wanted to do something different. Within LIGO, I had helped to train a new generation, so I was no longer needed in LIGO. That liberated me in that sense. And I wanted to explore my creativity in a completely different set of venues.
I am a professor at the University of Southern California, and my area of study is neurorehabilitation and physical therapy. We met at a party. Well, I was very attracted to him because he was so humble. So I said to him, then I found out that he learned how to dance because he grew up in a Mormon community. So then I got all worried that he was Mormon. Well, I then found out that he had been excommunicated from the Mormon church, initiated by his mother, who was upset about the Mormons' treatment of women. So that made me even more interested. So then we just hit it off. He's very considerate of my career and not threatened by my career, which, you know, a lot of men are. They sort of have an expectation for what women are supposed to do. Every time I cook dinner or empty the trash, he thanks me to this day. So I think that's, you know, pretty neat.
Kip is a legend in the theoretical physics community, so I was a little bit cowed, I would say. But I very quickly learned that he's a very down-to-earth person, very easy to talk to, very good ideas, extremely well-versed experimentally.
Science is ultimately to help people. One way is directly through medical interventions, and the other way is by shedding light on basic knowledge, opening new horizons. Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA. I saw Crick on television and it caught my imagination. The area I work in is called epigenetics. Our genes determine how our bodies are made and how they work. They're arranged in DNA on chromosomes.
Professor Adrian Byrd was born in Wolverhampton, England in 1947. He got a biochemistry degree from Sussex University and his PhD at Edinburgh University.
I heard about a laboratory in Edinburgh where they had isolated genes for the very first time, and I was really hooked. Recombinant DNA techniques and restriction enzymes.
As a postdoc in Zurich, Adrian realized
you could use restriction enzymes to look at an aspect of DNA that hadn't really been studied at all. DNA methylation. There are the two methyl groups, and they're added onto the DNA as part of the way in which genes are regulated by cells themselves. One of the ways one can try to find out how this whole system works is to find proteins that might read this signal.
In 1990, Adrian returned to Edinburgh University to take the Buchanan Chair of Genetics.
Using a series of biochemical tricks, what we found was that there were proteins that bound to our DNA when it was methylated and not when it wasn't methylated. One of those proteins was MECP2. We were trying to understand, how it binds to DNA and maybe represses gene expression. When
in 1999, a professor in Texas,
Huda Zogby, found that this disorder, Rett syndrome, caused almost exclusively by mutations in the gene that encode MECP2. Suddenly we had another reason to work on it.
Adrian's lab had already started on a mouse model, growing cells and destroying the MECP2 gene in them, then injecting them into mice.
But if you take away MECP2, then the mice die young.
In males, human males with Rett syndrome also die young. Females can live a normal lifespan.
The conclusion, the MECP2 deficient mouse is a pretty good model for Rett syndrome. So what happens if we were to put the gene back? We made a silent MECP2 gene. We put it into mice that could be switched on by drug treatment. And the mouse was quite ill, it didn't move.
We injected them with tamoxifen, which then turns the MECP2 gene back on, and it was just quite amazing that within a week the mice were running around again.
It's surprised everyone to find that this disorder, in mice at least, is completely reversible. There is every prospect that it would also be reversible in humans.
He's brought the cure for Rett syndrome much closer to fruition than it was.
I think it was very powerful at the time because a lot of neurological disorders were in fact potentially curable just by the forward thinking of Adrian.
A big door has opened, and for that I'm quite optimistic. We can now edit the genes within the brain, within various tissues in humans. It's very promising technology.
And we're also looking at rather more radical technologies that may allow us to cure. Well, hi, David.
How are you doing?
I am fine.
Adrian was one of the first to realise the importance of DNA methylation, applying that understanding to curing diseases. Adrian is a scientist. He's rigorous, he's enthusiastic.
So it's very, very good to be around him.
And he's quite happy that everyone's having fun while they're doing their work.
Does he have a good sense of humour?
Oh yeah, definitely.
He's a family man, he's a well-rounded human being.
I've always liked watching birds. I've always had to suffer the consequences because of my name. I photographed birds, I photographed insects. oregano. It's beautiful.
Why do you like cooking?
It's basically an experiment, and you get to eat it afterwards. So I adore pasta. I like fairly classical music, mainly Beethoven, I would say. This is my dad.
Kenneth Byrd was a journalist who wrote 13 children's books about a talking Irish dog that's a kidnapped target.
Because I was interested in drawing and cartooning, and I got to illustrate them.
Adrian and wife Kathy met at a scientific forum.
1988, 89, something like that.
Yeah.
Was it love at first sight? Or?
No. Oh, actually, no, I saw you giving a talk before that in 1987.
Yes.
But you didn't know I was there.
No. Admired from afar.
The couple married in 1993. Kathy is a genetics professor.
Yes, we discuss science quite a lot, but we have different interests outside science because Adrian likes watching sport. I like sewing and knitting and reading.
The couple has 4 children.
We get together over meals and we talk a lot, and then we kind of diverge and do our separate things.
It was more the holidays. We would spend a lot of time together. Dad would read us a bedtime story before, and he'd always do funny voices for each character.
Tom majors in physics.
Entirely possible I've been subconsciously influenced to study that through what they were able to teach me about how inspiring science can be.
I want to be an actress.
I'm very proud of the different interests and talents that they both have.
You're much better at the practical support than I am.
I think us 3 have a bad memory because it comes from Dad, but Mum's the only...
Mum does all the remembering.
At 69, will he retire soon?
I sniff the air intellectually. If I sense that my ability to do new stuff, think new thoughts, and motivate people to work is disappearing, then I would stop. Hasn't happened yet.
Dr. Huda Sogby, professor at Baylor College of Medicine and director of the Jan and Dan Duncan Neurological Research Institute, both in Houston, Texas. She won the Shaw Prize for identifying the connection between MECP2 and Rett syndrome.
My dream, of course, was to help the patients in the sense that you can diagnose it much earlier. If you discover somebody has Rett at 1 year of age and you enroll them in special therapeutic interventions, you will have a better outcome than if you don't make that diagnosis till they're 7 or 8 years old.
Huda earned her medical degree at Meharry Medical School in Nashville, Tennessee in 1979. In the 1980s, she did her residency in pediatrics and clinical neurology, as well as her postdoc at Baylor. She initially planned to become a pediatric neurologist.
I then met Ashley, a child with Rett syndrome, which at the time we did not really know about this syndrome.
Ashley was 5. She's now 36.
Ashley looks really good.
She was normal until her 18th month, when symptoms started appearing. The hand-wringing, the seizures from age 4, then scoliosis and back surgery at 11, and breathing problems. She lost her ability to walk, talk, and learn.
Eating is extremely a challenge for these girls. They grind their teeth all the time, so any good meal may take anywhere between 1 to 2 hours. Imagine spending 6 hours a day feeding. Some of the girls go through a screaming stage, and nobody really understands why.
A week after meeting Ashley, Huda encountered another girl with the same symptoms. She later found more cases at Texas Children's Hospital.
Many of them were misdiagnosed as autism because early on they lose communication. All girls, this must be a genetic disorder, and that's how I inspired to go into research.
Rett syndrome strikes 1 in 10,000, so cases are rare. It's often fatal for boys. 99% of female cases strike a family only once. Huda focused on 4 families that had 2 girls each with Rett syndrome.
The fact they were all girls still convinced me at least that it is maybe on the X chromosome.
Boys have an X and a Y sex chromosome. Girls have 2 X chromosomes. Huda looked for the Rett syndrome gene in the regions on the X chromosome the girls from the 4 families shared and inherited from their mothers. Genes from regions not shared were eliminated. Huda narrowed the search down to the tip of the X chromosome. That region had around 200 genes. It took 16 years to sift through those genes.
It was a very painstaking search. Back then, the genome was not precisely mapped. Almost every gene to exclude would take several months. Imagine doing this year after year after year and finding no difference. People are starting to doubt if this is a genetic disorder. You're getting skeptics from the funders, the scientific community telling you you're wasting your time.
In 1999, Huda's lab finally found the mutant gene. The gene makes a protein, MACP2, crucial for neurons to help us talk, learn, and move, as well as other functions. Neurons increase as the brain matures. A mutation in the gene reduces the protein's level in brain cells and disrupts neurons from doing their job. Huda's discovery helped doctors diagnose earlier and treat Rett syndrome.
She has probably the best instincts I've seen in any scientist. She goes after it with everything she has.
Studying a rare genetic disease where most individuals may not have even heard about would have been considered a decision for career suicide, so to speak. Advantage of hindsight, that actually was a great decision on her.
Professor Arthur Baudet is Huda's mentor.
People like myself interact with maybe 100 postdocs and students in the course of your time in training. And from the first moment until today, Huda's always achieved at incredibly high levels. I've had a lot of satisfying events in terms of recognition over time, but she's outshined the mentor.
I grew up in Beirut. During my first year medical school, the civil war broke out. The war intensified, and my parents insisted that I leave with my 2 younger siblings and come to the States just for the summer. I had a sister here, and I tried to go back, but the war escalated. I ended up in Nashville, Tennessee, and continued on with medical school there.
She met her husband, William, a cardiologist, in med school in Beirut. William later followed Huda to Tennessee, where he studied as well. They settled in Texas and have 2 children.
It's amazing, actually, to be with her because although she's very renowned, as a wife and companion would be, and maybe even better, because it didn't get to her head. When we're at home, we're at home. She strikes an amazing balance.
My mom has done an incredible job balancing career and family. There were many nights where she did have to work after dinner or on the weekends, but she never missed anything that was really critical for me. She was there for all those important moments.
There's no cure yet for Rett syndrome, but studies are being done to treat symptoms. In deep brain stimulation with mice, fine electrodes are put on parts of the brain responsible for memory and learning.
We try to test their spatial orientation. We put them in a big tub of milky water, and we hide where the platform is. We train them using spatial clues, and the Rett mice learn much, much better after the deep brain stimulation.
It'll take years before the therapy is tried on girls with Rett syndrome, but Huda's in for the long haul.
The question I'm most frequently asked is what made me persist all those years. First and foremost, the girls. I've seen so many of them, I really felt I have to figure out what this is about to help the girls.
Oxford University. Nigel Hitchin came here as an undergraduate math major. Now he's civilian professor of geometry.
The deeper you go into mathematics, the more you realize that there's more to learn. So the momentum of wanting to know what's just around the corner is what kept me going into an academic life. Before I went to university, I got a temporary job in the computer department of Rolls-Royce in Derby.
Nigel was born in a small village near Derby. At school, a maths teacher strongly influenced him.
Solving a problem as a kick, a buzz. I won a scholarship to come to Oxford.
From his first year, Nigel was taught by Oxford doyen Sir Michael Atiyah, who became his mentor and collaborator.
Nigel is a good student who improves with age and becomes more and more deeper mathematician over the years. There are enough people now.
It opened up a much wider perspective. He brought analysis, index theory, elliptic operators.
One of the hallmarks of Nigel's career is that many of the ideas have turned out to be very fruitful in physics.
This is one which is, in some respects, close to classical physics. I mean, minimal surfaces, surface tension, applying algebraic geometry in problems of gauge theory. It could also be applied to study minimal surfaces in a three-dimensional sphere. Minimal surfaces are like soap bubbles. Some of the basic ideas, gauge invariance, moduli spaces, and so forth, can transform into mathematics. One particular area, which are now called Higgs bundles, has been particularly influential. You can transform the geometry of what we're looking at into actual equations. Individuals have actually identified many of the known integrable systems as very special cases of this. And this is what's called the Hitchin vibration. The fibers are these higher dimensional tori. They degenerate into, in that case, 5 circles.
That they are all related came to him in a mountain cottage in Canada.
I suddenly realized, wait, this may be an example of an integrable system. I wasn't particularly thinking about mathematics. This happens all the time.
He always had very deep and original ideas. And every idea he had turned out to be very profitable for many people.
It's curiosity driven, and the feeling that there's something there to be discovered, which may, of course, be important to other mathematicians or to other fields.
15 years ago, Nigel developed what he called generalized geometry.
Purely to make sense of a problem which came from string theory. But it turned out to be a language which simplified some of the equations that were written in theoretical physics.
From his Higgs bundle theory came...
The so-called Hitchin component is beautiful, it's powerful, but it also opens the door to many other things.
The Hitchin system had a very rich geometric structure, and that's spawned basically an entire field of mathematics.
Nigel has a raft of eponymous discoveries.
It's embarrassing because my input to them can vary. You know, sometimes it's really fundamental, sometimes it may be an observation which I've shared with somebody.
He's a very modest person, both personally and mathematically.
I never sat down to write a book.
He's written about 100 papers.
This dates back to '77. It's all about a topic called instantons. It gave me a great deal of pleasure.
It led to other problems, such as monopoles.
Three-dimensional versions of the instantons, you can construct a theory which makes them move around. They've always been, in a sense, close to my heart, mathematically.
Nigel's a very intellectually open person who listens and thinks about other people's ideas.
He's a humble worker, like a gardener, and things grow.
I quite like repetitive work, like cutting the grass or weeding. You can think about things like mathematics.
In the early 1970s, Nigel moved to Princeton as Michael Atiyah's assistant and met his wife, Nida, getting a master's degree in deaf education at Columbia University.
I went to Princeton for the weekend. I liked him very much when I first met him. I don't know what he thought.
Yeah. And I was coming out of the woods in the Institute grounds and walked past the lake, and that I was
reading.
There,
I was reading a book and doing my...
And then she said, "Oh, Nigel," and I said, who's this? And then I said, ah. And then we talked, and then we went and had a pizza somewhere, I think.
They married in August 1973 in Nida's country of Colombia.
I go back, but he doesn't. He comes with me next time. Yeah, it's about time, after 43 years.
Oh, no!
The couple has 2 children and 2 grandkids.
He's the best mathematician I've ever known. Even though I do beat him at chess quite a lot of the time.
Do you want to be a mathematician then?
Or maybe a scientist, I don't know.
A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P.
Well done. I can remember asking my dad to play fight with me, and one day he decided, I'm going to teach you something that's a bit like fighting, and then he got out a chessboard, and I just thought that's a masterclass in parenting. Amazing.
He doesn't have his head in the clouds. He's very hands-on with us.
You always say he never lost his temper with you as a kid.
That's true.
The few times that you have lost your temper, I've realised that it's for a valid reason.
He's a great father-in-law, great grandfather. He makes a very, very good Sunday roast.
He's been a wonderful husband. From the beginning of our marriage, he would come home very, very tired with big circles under his eyes, and I knew that he had been discussing a lot of very important things. I work as an audiologist, and now I'm enjoying my retirement. I'm looking forward to Nigel's retirement.
It dates from like the early 1700s. Basically, it's a toilet.
It needs a lot of renovation. I would like Nigel to have it as a study, so he's not in the house all the time.
Nigel retires end of September when he turns 70.
But I'll continue working in the Mathematical Institute here and collaborating with people around the world. Still have plenty of ideas.